Okay, so yes, thank you again for coming. My name is Benjamin Yoder. I'm with the website called onecontrolreport.com. It is just me, so there's nobody else on the website. And it's more of just a YouTube channel these days more than anything. But it makes me happy having a website, so I continue to use it when I can. So yeah, today I want to talk a little bit about the PC-FX, which is a game console that has a pretty deep history in kind of like the anime fandom. That's kind of its main target audience, which we'll talk about a little bit today. And I also want to talk a little bit about the history of the console itself and about the actual space around or in the industry and kind of why the system ended up how it is. I'm not going to go too much into the development of the hardware or anything like that. There is this actually pretty interesting history about how the system kind of came to be what it was in terms of the actual components inside. But I don't have enough time for that today, unfortunately. So we will largely skip over that. But yeah, I'm going to start with just a handful of quick facts here. One thing I do want to kind of stress that this panel was kind of put together last minute. So when it comes to information I'm providing, I'd say a lot of this is kind of considered to be like internet common knowledge about the system. But in the looking up of this information, I found there's often kind of spotty sources on a lot of it. So I'm going to say this because this is kind of our general understanding of what the system is in a lot of ways. But I would say individual facts might be worth looking into further if you are going to cite any information from this presentation itself. But yeah, the system was released in 1994. It was actually in December specifically, and this was like a really turbulent time in the game industry. You know, this is like early 3D graphics were kind of coming to play with consoles. CDs were not new at this point, but we were finally getting systems that really integrated that as this kind of main distribution of games rather than game cartridges. So it's kind of a weird period in the industry. And as we mentioned a little bit earlier before the panel started, you know, this is kind of in some ways, the successor to the TurboGrafx 16 and the PC Engine. So the TurboGrafx 16, you know, is a system that was basically competing alongside the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis. Didn't have a huge market share, but it definitely was around and relevant. If you know, games like Bonk, Yeast, those kind of titles kind of originate on that platform to some degree. There's another PC legacy behind that, which we'll talk about here in a second. So it was, around in the United States, but it wasn't particularly popular, to say the least. But in Japan, they had the same system, which was called the PC Engine over there, and that actually was a pretty successful system. So it had a pretty substantial library, and kind of over time, people kind of grabbed onto the system, and it became kind of like an import gaming darling to a lot of retro game fans. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's relevant to the PC-FX and kind of its reception during today's presentation. The other kind of aspect of this is the system is that it's kind of adjacent to a line of computers called the PC-98. So if you're not familiar with what the PC-98 is, it basically is this kind of early to late 90s series of computers that NEC was putting out. And I'm not an expert in the PC-98 space or the home computer space in Japan in specific, but kind of my understanding about the PC-98 space is that, it was a very region-specific platform in terms of operating system and what software can operate there was for more or less it was region locked for the most part. So the game space that developed on the PC-98 is actually fairly unique, and there's a lot of things that, at least over in the West, we don't really know about that space in terms of the games on there. But more people over the recent years have been kind of looking into them. But it does have some influences on the PC-FX itself, not only in terms of the games that show up on the PC-FX, but you can also see there's a few different through lines to the system itself. So I have here a game called Zack 3 for the PC-98, my favorite RPG series, as in I have no idea what this is and have not played it yet. But it's a big box PC game, hard plastic sides here. And so PC-FX games, the original packaging very much was in the similar form factor. It's a little smaller, but it is this kind of same type of style of packaging. And while this has 5 floppy disks in it, this only has a CD in it. So it's kind of overkill in a lot of ways. And like the PlayStation and Saturn, eventually it would adopt more of a dual case format for the games itself. So there's just some light ties there. I'd say what's more relevant is the actual software, which is on the system and how that kind of relates to the PC-98 itself. So I want to go a little bit over kind of the console space at this time. We had a handful of systems here. There's definitely more systems that were in the market at this time, but these are just the ones I want to kind of focus on a little bit. The top three there, I'm going to guess you guys know about, the Nintendo 64, the PlayStation, and the Saturn. And the big thing I kind of want to just emphasize is just like how strange the industry was at this point in terms of like, nobody really fully understood where things were going. Like with the Nintendo 64, obviously they stuck to cartridges rather than going with CDs instead, and they were kind of the weird ones out with that. And then like on the Sega Saturn side, it was initially planned to be a 2D only console essentially, and then over time, or at least as the story goes, is that they essentially slapped on some additional hardware towards the back half of development to make it a 3D based system. So it just wasn't necessarily clear at the time where things were going or how quickly 3D was going to become a thing in this console space. And then what's also weird about this era is we have a series of like other consoles that were around, which isn't something that really happened after this. Even during like the Xbox, GameCube, and PS2 era, you didn't really have just kind of these lingering small platforms. But you had like the 3DO that was active around that time, and then also like the Atari Jaguar. It just is a really weird and dynamic time in the industry. So when thinking about the PC-FX and its strengths and why they made a lot of the decisions they made, I think you just need to look at the space around it to see like everybody was kind of doing different things. So it's every platform was a little unique in a lot of ways. So the PC-FX strengths themselves, a couple things. One, CD-ROMs were a big thing. A lot of platforms ended up going with CD-ROM at this time. But it was one of the earlier platforms where you could really rely on that to be the main form of, games and how they're distributed. Where beforehand on like the Sega CD and the TurboGrafx, there was like CD add-ons. So you kind of had this split between the different libraries. So on the PC-FX, every game was built with CD media in mind. And that kind of plays a big role in having CD quality audio, and then also being able to put full motion video, which we'll talk about here in a second. The second thing, and this is somewhat unique to this system, is that unlike the Saturn, it did not pivot towards the end of its production. It stuck with the 2D graphics as being its primary focus. Now, that's not to say it can't do 3D. There's some very like edge case scenarios where you can do like software rendering. But for all intents and purposes, this is a 2D only system. There is like reports online that basically there was potentially going to be some kind of add-on card that would add 3D functionality. But if that was actually true or not, that never actually surfaced into anything that actually came out. So it was basically a canceled add-on essentially. And the last bit here I want to really kind of highlight is that this is a system that was really focused on full motion video. In a lot of ways, they kind of tout that this is, of the generation, the best looking console when it comes to the compressed video. Like I think they're using like motion JPEG technology. I don't want to get too deep into that. But for the most part, this looks, at least in my eyes, it looks pretty close to most other platforms and how their compressed video looks. It may be slightly better than the other systems, but you're kind of looking at very similar video quality to like the Saturn or the PlayStation in a lot of ways. However, this does have like a big influence on the types of games that are made. Full motion video is definitely used in a way that is more typical to most other consoles, like with, just cutting in anime cutscenes and things like that. But it also plays a role where there are some games that are built entirely with full motion video in mind as kind of its main delivery mechanic of the game, and it's the part of the game you kind of access. So I want to go on a little bit of a history of these types of games a little bit and just talk a little bit about it and be maybe a little bit of a full motion video apologist in some ways. I think there are reasons why you build games this way. So one game I'm going to want to highlight here real quick is pretty popular, and it's Dragon's Lair. This is not on the PC-FX. But with Dragon's Lair itself, essentially you have these series of animations that play out, and essentially the player has to basically put in inputs at a particular time, and if they successfully do it, it essentially plays it so they go to the next cutscene, essentially, of where Dirk the Daring here succeeds. However, if you do put it in like a wrong input at the wrong time or something along those lines, essentially the cutscene ends and then it goes to Dirk dying in some creative way. I think in the case of this one, he gets like rolled over by one of these balls or something like that. But yeah, it's It's not super, interactive in a lot of ways, but this game came out in like 1983. So keep in mind, this is like, before Super Mario Brothers was even something that was, a thing in the US at least. So I think there's a lot to be said about just the visual quality of this game and being able to have some level of control over something that looks this good versus, a more traditional arcade game back then. It's definitely a novelty, and, there's a reason why these games don't exist this way today. But I do think that there's a strong reason that you could make it at the time of the benefits of making a full motion video game. So again, that was like 1983. So this is like a strategy that kind of went forward from here. This is 10 years later. This is a game called Supreme Warrior for the 3DO. And it's like a first-person brawler where you have literally just somebody with a camera recording this dude punching at you, essentially. But it's the same concept here. Basically, there's like certain points of the video where you need to block, certain points where you could punch and kick, and all that good stuff. And this is pretty common around the time of, I think a lot of these games kind of moved away from animation in the West specifically, probably because it was just so much cheaper to just record somebody doing this. And in a lot of ways, even Supreme Warrior, which was coming out, I think, 1994, 3D graphics were still very early on at this point, so you really couldn't have this level of detail in a 3D game. Obviously, the limitations of what you can actually show and what you can actually have the player do is still there. But I think there is a good reason to try to do something like this. And again, I just think the novelty factor had enough pull that you could play maybe a couple of these types of games and still get some enjoyment out of them. So the PC-FX, this is going to be the first PC-FX game we're looking at. This is a title called Battle Heat. It looks very similar to Supreme Warrior. It is a one-on-one fighting game, but and it has very Street Fighter-like inputs. So you do directional inputs that basically have the characters do special moves. You have kind of high and low punches and things like that. And it is more in that anime Fist of the North Star style. And what I've really noticed in these full motion video type games, and from Japan specifically, they really didn't seem to go that much with recordings of people. They almost always kind of did some kind of animation aspect to it. And because the PC-FX is a console that basically only released in Japan, the majority of the games look more like this than anything. Now, I will say Battle Heat is, like I said earlier, one of those kind of FMV based games. There are a lot of people who tell you that the console is only comprised of these games. That is not true. That is a subsegment of the platform. There are multiple games like this on the system, but there are plenty of other genres that we'll talk about today or games on the system, essentially. So there's my little FMV subsegment there. So to get back to the target audience of this platform, essentially, this is essentially a console that was in a lot of ways marketed towards otaku. Using the strengths of full motion video and things like that, they really leaned into that kind of anime aspect of the system. And while otaku as a term probably was not super flattering at the time, it was very much still that focus on people who had an obsessiveness over manga and anime in a lot of ways. So you have a lot of very character-focused games that focus a lot on building relationships with characters and telling the story of individual characters throughout the game's plot itself. But what kind of comes from that is you have this kind of tie-in to celebrity voice actors of the era. So, I think in the West these days, we do have more like a celebrity voice actor status. I mean, there's voice actors that come to conventions like these and talk all the time, right? But in Japan, it's kind of been there for a very long time. And in 1994, that was very much true as well. So they kind of had these voice actors they'd put up on a pedestal, and so the PC-FX is a system that often would bring in a lot of those actors to come in and kind of promote the systems in a lot of ways. And it's a platform that leans into the fandom itself in terms of, with these kind of cultures and in terms of people interested in these kind of games, they typically would buy a lot of products surrounding a character. You have the whole here's this character's birthday thing and have a celebration with that, right? And so especially with the later games on the system, there's a lot of merchandise out there you can find, essentially. So there's a lot of individual character items that you can go and buy, and they will suck as much money out of you as possible for your love of this character, essentially. And that it very much kind of fits within that space. And the last thing here is just that there's a level of fan service on this system in terms of like the sexual sense. It is a platform that in a lot of ways to me feels a lot like late night anime kind of thing. When you play games on this system, you are going to see some skin. You may even see more than that to some degree, and there are some 18 plus games on the system. But it is kind of just the nature of the platform itself. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I think it's kind of up to you to some degree. But it's just kind of part of this culture this time. Now, one thing I really want to stress about these points I've made here is that none of these things on screen here are specific to the PC-FX. If you import games to the PlayStation, if you import games to the Saturn, you are going to find games like this. You know, that is it's not just a PC-FX specific phenomenon here. But what was interesting about the PC-FX is that it was a hardcore commitment to these types of games. The PlayStation has so much more going on. The Saturn has so much more going on. The PC-FX is like, no, this is what we're doing essentially. So on Nintendo platforms, you have Mario. On, Sega, not during the Saturn era really, but, you had Sonic for Sega, right? But on the PC-FX, they're like, hello, meet Princess Rolfee. She's our mascot for the character, and she's a little anime girl. And we're going to dress her up in a bunch of outfits and put her in a variety of games. And so I think in choosing Rolfee as, like, the main face of this system, I think it shows the commitment to that type of audience. And I think over time, Rolfee kind of more and more embodies the types of games that were coming out on the PC-FX. But at least early on, it showed that they just had this commitment to this like anime aesthetic in a lot of ways. And I will say, kind of upfront, like I mentioned earlier, the sexual fan service kind of thing. This is also still in the era of like the kind of sexy, cute kind of thing that a lot of people did. And so it is also true with Rolfee and a lot of other younger looking characters. There are more sexy drawings of it. I chose to opt out on including those today, but it is something that is there for this. So how about actual video games? The launch lineup itself was about 3 games. We talked about Battle Heat already. And while these games in some ways are maybe a little unique for what actually ended, or maybe a little different than what the system kind of ended off on, I think a lot of them kind of set the seeds of what this platform would kind of aim to do in a lot of ways. So we showed Battle Heat earlier, heavily FMV based game with an anime aesthetic. There are more games that are basically, I don't want to say identical to it, but it uses a lot of the same form factors of like 2 characters fighting each other, and you put in inputs to do attacks and things like that. So that is one of the kind of branches on the system of the types of games you have. The other one is Team Innocent here, and Team Innocent's a kind of a neat one. So this is kind of a unique title to the system because it is this survival horror game. There isn't really anything else on it on the system like it. But there are a lot of games of this era that were coming out like this. But this game in particular just has a really unique look because it is being on a 2D system, it has these 2D sprite-based characters and pre-rendered backgrounds rather than like 3D characters. But another kind of unique thing about this too is the tone of the game itself. So a lot of these types of survival horror games like Resident Evil, Alone in the Dark, and stuff like that are maybe not Alone in the Dark so much, but Resident Evil for sure, have like a B-movie style to it where it's a lot of cheesy voice acting, right? They usually be in English voice acting in the Japanese version because they're replicating that. This game takes a much more anime approach. You have these like 3 operators here, and you have them kind of banter about. This scene in particular, Saki's kind of shocked by this zombie here, but Lilith is this very like cool and calculated person, and she's just kind of like, whatever, yeah, deal with it. But then you have like the typical 90s spunky anime girl with Ariel here. And you can't hear the music here, but there's a lot of like really upbeat, peppy music during these conversations, and the characters are very emotive, and you have these like on-screen portraits of these characters like smiling and laughing. So for a game that's essentially supposed to be like a space horror game with DNA experiments and things like that, it's kind of an interesting contrast. And so while there's nothing quite like this on the system, I think that tone itself kind of leans into what you kind of expect from the games going forward on the system, with even if it's a more serious game, having that kind of fun banter between certain characters. The last launch game is actually a multi-platform game. This is Graduation 2. This came out on a lot of platforms, including the PC-98 itself, and this is a game that feels very much more in the line with that Japanese computer market. This is a simulation game, essentially, or raising sim, I guess. You're basically this high school teacher, and you choose the curriculum. for these students, and then depending on how that curriculum goes, they kind of end up in different results afterwards. If you're familiar with the title called Princess Maker, similar thing, depending on how you raise them, you get different endings and things like that, and your relationship with them kind of changes to some degree. And so there are a lot of games on the system that have these more complex stat-based mechanics where the things you do change how a character develops or how their relationship with you develops, and that changes kind of the ending outcome of the game itself. But this game in specific, on the PC-FX, I think there's like 2 or 3 of them or something like that, but they actually have like a live action version as well. It's one of the few games on the PC-FX where they have like recorded people actually doing FMV cutscenes for it, which is kind of neat. So beyond the launch lineup, there's kind of 2 genres that kind of really become a big focus of the system. One is romantic adventure games. You could probably think of these as visual novels here in the West. The terms visual novels is kind of loaded when you start talking about these types of games and the niche audience that is into them, because it is a very broad term that does not really fit every game per se. But, essentially with romantic adventure games, these are typically like bishoujo games. You got a lot of girls. This is a first kiss story up here. There are, as you can see, all these girls are dateable, and there's 3 more. So it is a very packed game full of ladies you can date. And it's basically, you go around and you basically choose different like text options for changing kind of the outcome in your relationships. In the case of First Kiss Story, there's also like a town you go around and you choose different locations, and depending on where you go for a date determines who you meet and things like that. Otome games are definitely a thing on this system, although less so than bishoujo games. I guess I should say bishoujo games are girl-based dating games. Otome games are guy-based dating games. Otome games are less of a thing on here. It's mostly the Angelique series that came out, if you're familiar with that. But it is a bunch of, handsome men, kind of the same thing on the other side. The Angelique games in particular have some overworld elements where you're kind of walking around and stuff. There's also like an RPG Angelique game on the system too. It wasn't as big of a thing, and I could be wrong. I don't think there's any PC-FX exclusive Otome games, so anything that came out, I believe, ended up on other platforms at some point. And then with this, like I mentioned earlier, with kind of the fan commitment to it, there's that waifu and husband culture that comes with this. Like what I mentioned earlier, tons of merchandise. You will find plenty of First Kiss Story merchandise on the internet that is dirt cheap, and I buy all of it because that is me now, and nobody else wants it but me. So RPGs is another big thing on this system. This is something that a lot of people kind of skip over, although at the end of the day, they usually kind of still blow it off because it is still all in Japanese, and who wants to play a Japanese RPG? Me. But, that's not everybody. Or I should say Japanese language RPG, not a JRPG. But anyways, but yeah, this is very much feels like an extension of the 16-bit era of JRPG. So a lot of like isometric 2D sprite-based games. You're kind of walking around an overworld and things like that. Strategy RPGs plays very similar, like a Fire Emblem kind of grid-based, mechanic where you're moving these characters around, and then that eventually you finish the fight, you move on to the next chapter kind of thing. These games are pretty standard for the most part, in my opinion, at least. But they are kind of accentuated by the PC-FX's strengths. There are plenty of cutscenes, but there's also a lot of voice acting too. The game on screen here is called Miraculum: The Last Revelation, and even like in the more like standard cutscenes where you're just kind of walking around, your sprites just on screen, just standing there or whatever, and there's like a blue text box with text at the bottom right. They still add voice acting to those segments too. So it's a pretty extensive use of voice acting, and obviously it's going to vary per game how much there is, but it's just kind of a lean into those elements with those. Now, probably what is my favorite set of games that came out on the system are games that in some ways kind of combined everything we've talked about so far. And the ultimate result of that usually turns out to be like a dating RPG kind of thing, right? So this game on screen here is Blue Breaker. And it's basically a game where you play as this guy, I think his name's Kane, and you can meet, I think it's like up to 12 girls throughout the game, and they will join your party, and you get these like nice FMV cutscenes when you meet them and everything. And you have to build relationships with these characters as you go through, and then depending at the end, who you meet with, essentially you get a cutscene at the end that is like you marrying them essentially. what's kind of neat about this is it's not just like dialogue choices you make with these characters. In the case of this game, the characters are very sensitive to a lot of things you do, including things like literally taking people out of the party. So essentially, you know, things like literally like taking party or members in and out of your party will affect like their relationship with you and like if they take damage and things like that. So it's not just, you know, the choices you make in terms of when you're talking with them. It actually makes this game kind of a big pain to play, and it's kind of infamous in a lot of ways because it is very challenging to complete it with a proper ending, essentially. And this is a title that also showed up on PlayStation and Saturn later as well. Although the Saturn version's pretty broken, so don't play that one. So these are all like very anime fan adjacent, you know, genres, RPGs, visual novels, stuff like that. There is actually anime games on the system. You know, this system was alive from 1994 to 1998. And, you know, the typical franchise you'd expect. I don't know if it's like Oh My Goddess or Oh My Goddess here in the US, but that series. There's also a Tenchi Muyo game here. And these, a lot of the times, are, again, kind of fall in that visual novel space. How visual novel they are, you know, varies. But, you know, a lot of talking head games, and you can make decisions in them usually, or have the character go to different locations, things like that. We also have this game called Akazuken Cha-Cha. I don't know anything about the Akazuken Cha-Cha anime, but it's like this weird RPG board game, and you have a bunch of characters that are running around the map, and you go in fights, and the moves you do, like, play these animated cutscenes. It's kind of neat. I have not been able to figure out how to complete a game in it yet. So it just seems to go on and on, but it seems like a fun little thing. So there are definitely other games from different anime series on this system, and we'll talk about a couple more here. But what I really also want to highlight is something called the Anime Freak discs. And these are essentially digital magazines that came out for the system. There's like 6 of them, I think. And these have a bunch of content on here that are either anime specific, anime adjacent, or they are PC-FX game specific, you know, as well. So they kind of fits within that category. And there's a lot of weird things with this. Oh, there's Rolfee again. Hello, Rolfee. And so you have things like these voice actor interviews that kind of come into play here, as I mentioned earlier, with like kind of the celebrity voice actor thing. So you have these just talk shows essentially that are on the disc. It looks very similar to like a modern stream for these kind of things, in my opinion. It's like, oh, not much has changed in the last 20, 30 years, but you know, you essentially have just these popular voice actors talking about the show that they're working on. This is actually really cool. So this is a series of anime clips from a variety of different anime that they just throw on the disc. So you can basically select from any of these, and it'll play like I'd say 10 to 20 second clip from some random anime. And one thing to keep in mind is that like video sharing on the internet was a very different thing in 1994. And so there was not a lot of ways to necessarily, you know, get your hands on just random clips of anime just to check it out and just see what's going on and maybe make some decisions. So you're like, man, that's a great looking hallway scene. I'm going to go buy that anime or get something like that. But yeah, it's just kind of neat to think about, you know, being able to buy this and just like get these little bite-sized chunks of shows and before where you'd have to buy like VHSs and things like that, right? Of whole series. There's also some karaoke on here if you want. There's probably about like 2 of these per disc. So we got Evangelion here. Even though I don't have sound, I imagine you guys can probably hear this music in your head. I will be honest with you, this is the most Evangelion I've ever seen in my life. So I have no familiar with the series, but you know, I know it's pretty popular. So I thought I would bring it up here. And then there's also like full anime episodes on here as well. And that includes some shows that were actually airing at the time. In the case of what I have in this, we have a show called Private Idol, and this is actually an OVA specifically made for this Anime Freaks disc, and it's based off basically this idol who is also a detective, and she also fights. And so it's a pretty action-oriented show, and usually there's like some detective elements. It's based off like a PC Engine game actually. That's actually looks pretty neat, but as far as I'm aware, this only ever released in 2 places on these Anime Freak discs, and there's also a Windows 95 disc as well. So if you're aware of any other Private Idol media, let me know, because I have no idea where else it is. And I would like better quality versions of them, because both of them are pretty poorly compressed. So they're just like really neat little like package discs that you have that just have, you know, a lot of different information on there. There's a lot of text in them too, so if you can actually read Japanese, you get like little newsletters and things like that. You can see products that were coming out at the time, a lot of fun stuff like that. So, as you might expect, in 1994, this console didn't do super amazing. There's only about 400,000 systems that were sold. To put that number into context, Nintendo's worst-selling system, the Virtual Boy, sold a little around like 2 times amount as that. So not a lot of these units were sold. Also, only about 60 video games came out for it. So it's a very small library, and I could be wrong. I think that number includes the Anime Freak disc. So video games, there's at least 55 of them that you can actually play. And I think a lot of the problem with this is just that incredibly niche focus and the fact that I mentioned earlier that you could get a lot of the very similar things on Saturn and PlayStation. So those kind of fans were satiated from other platforms in terms of the content that was coming out. And because those platforms were much more popular, in some ways you had more of that content coming out. Again, like I said earlier, what makes the PC-FX kind of interesting is that this was the console's sole focus, not so much that it was the only place you could get these kind of things. The Japanese reception and like how people feel about this console is a little hard to read because there's not a lot of resources online. You can kind of go read like various posts, blogs, and tweets and things like that. People who are positive on this system seem to kind of relate it to like a premium console. It was very expensive, but the fact that you could get a lot of these kind of interesting informational pieces about anime, like and just like buy these discs that will give you like this immense catalog of things to watch and learn about voice actors and things like that, made it seem like a premium system in a lot of ways. If you're getting this very behind the scenes approach to the anime industry when you're buying a system like this. There's also kind of the rise of the internet at this point, and I think there is kind of a fan community that built up around the PC-FX that were very tight-knit on like, bulletin board systems and things like that at the time. So you had people who started conversing online, and they were able to meet with other people. And again, because the system's focus was so specific to this thing, the people talking about the system were very, very much in the same space and same mindset. So it probably was an easy way to be like, hey, do you have a PC-FX? We will probably be friends if we both have a PC-FX. So, however, outside Japan, and again, I want to stress that is like very niche things from reading online. That that does not mean that's the overall like memory of the system in Japan specifically. In America, things are quite a bit different, or at least in the West in general. People do not like the system very much usually, for a lot of reasons, and a lot of them are very valid. One is the language barrier aspect. This system never came out in the US, as I mentioned earlier, and as far as I can tell, it was never planned to come out in the US. Like I mentioned earlier, the TurboGrafx did not do particularly great here, and it didn't seem like NEC was super interested in following up on that system in the West. Also, anime in 1994, not super marketable. So if that is in the West at least, so if that is your pure focus on your system, you're probably launching a very expensive product for a very small audience already, even smaller than what's in Japan, right? So when you actually, have people who import this system and they start trying to play these games, these games are hard to get into. They are typically meant for adults, so there's some pretty complicated text in here. If you're familiar with Japanese language, a lot of these games have some pretty dense kanji. So it's a rough system to just pop a disc in and try to play a game. There's also the side of things where there's a lack of context. So as I mentioned earlier, like some of these games, like the Graduation 2 was coming out of spaces like the PC-98, where they had a lot of these like raising and simulation games, but in the West, we didn't really have that. So people were like buying these games like, why am I high school teacher who is assigning my students homework? How is this a video game and why is this fun, kind of thing. And because of the language barrier issue, even if they wanted to get to a position that they could actually, understand that and like interact with the game, it would have been very, very hard to, at least at the time. These days, you have a little more leniency with like translation tools, putting like camera translation tools to the screen. You can get a bit more details about how a game works that way. And then there's also the PC Engine legacy, and I don't want to point too many fingers with this stuff, but PC Engine fans come from a very specific background usually, and that's usually they started importing a lot of PC-FX games and like, oh wow, these are some really high quality, very import-friendly PC Engine games rather, sorry. And there's a ton of those games. It's super high quality. You'd be able to import a bunch of games and you're going to find some hits. And this system is very much not that. This system is very difficult to get into, and most people will import it and then run into the two problems I mentioned earlier with the context and barrier. And so there's an increased sense of disappointment from, wow, the PC Engine was so great and amazing in all these ways, and the PC-FX is everything that system was not. I've mentioned earlier before we started that like part of the reason why I probably like this console is I came at it backwards. I was importing a lot of PlayStation games, and then I ended up playing a bunch of games that had very similar styles to PC-FX games, and then found out about the PC-FX and kind of came backwards to it. So I came kind of primed knowing what to expect coming into the system, and I think that has made my enjoyment more, or I've enjoyed the console more. And then there's also the limited viewpoints on this, and kind of the problem with these systems is because they are so niche and not many people are interacting with them. Again, only came out in Japan. You don't have a lot of people talking about these online, and the people who do talk about them typically came into the system again from the PC Engine legacy. So that kind of becomes the prevailing narrative, and there's not a lot of other voices in that space. And so you have a lot of influencers on YouTube and stuff like that that'll go on, and they will come at it from that very PC Engine style approach. And it's a very negative opinion of the system. And because that is the majority of the conversation out there from that viewpoint, there's a lot of negative thoughts on the system and also a lot of misinformation in a lot of ways. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of people tell you that some games are only full motion video, but the games I've showed you today, we saw RPGs playing, we saw Team Innocent, survival horror game where you're running around and, doing that stuff. So it's definitely not just a system where you are pressing a button and something happens in a full motion video cutscene. So it's just a little hard to change a lot of people's opinions when the prevailing discourse online is that this system is a piece of garbage all the time. Which I want to say that like those opinions are valid. Again, all these things are very valid reasons to not like the PC-FX for sure. But it's just the fact that that is kind of one of the only viewpoints on the internet I think really hurts the system. And because people have that, like, even if they've never played a PC-FX, people will typically have a negative opinion because of those people from that line of conversation, essentially. So I'm sure I've convinced all of you definitely want to play the PC-FX today. And you might be like, whoa, man, can I play games on it? Well, it's very complicated. It is a very handy console where it's not like the PC-98 where you're trying to like import a Japanese computer and get like Windows running on it. This is a console, game console. So you're going to plug it in, you're just going to boot up, and it's going to work for the most part. So the bigger problem is asking what games can I actually play on this system? And if you ask any PC-FX person what games to play, they're going to tell you about 3 games that I call the Holy Trinity. That is, I blanked on the name all of a sudden. Kishin, Douji, Zenki, Vajura Fight. And this is a very much like brawler kind of, side-scrolling beat-em-up kind of game. This is based off an anime as well. And it's only about an hour long, but it has like these neat Street Fighter special moves. It's 2 players, and it's a very like flashy game. It kind of feels like a roller coaster ride as you go through it. Just there's constantly action happening, and you just have a lot of voice acting. There's actually some really neat uses of full motion video for some background elements in the game too. So it's pretty cool. This game is Chip Chan Kick. It's like a single screen arcade game where you go around, and if you're familiar with Bubble Bobble, it plays a little bit like that. You have this ball and you throw it at enemies, and when you hit them, it stuns them and you can kick them. And when you kick them, they roll around the map. And so if you roll enemies into other enemies, then it will basically combo them and you get a higher score and things like that. One thing I will say about this game, this kind of falls into that like 90s cute sexy kind of thing. So these characters are very young looking, and they very much like to put them in positions that are concerning to some people for sure. And then we have Choujin Zeroigar. And what you're going to notice here, there's actually English text on screen. This is one of the 2 fan-translated PC-FX games. And so even if you didn't have the translation, though, this is very playable, top-down shooter. What's kind of neat about this game is it has like a power-up system where you can basically unlock new weapons and you can level them up. And you can essentially equip them at any time and utilize them. The other aspect of this game that I haven't really seen in any other shooter, but I'm not a big shooter fan, so I could be just missing something, is you're going to see here if we die, we get like a stats screen here, and we have EXP, and that's going to apply to our ship. We're going to fix our armor and everything, and any excess EXP is going to apply to our ship's level. So unlike a lot of shooters where a lot of the success of them comes down to, memorization and things like that, this is a game where you can kind of grind through it like an RPG in some ways. So those are definitely the 3 titles that you'll hear most about on the system. And personally, I kind of find them to be some of the less interesting titles because they do just feel like normal video games. And I'm like, I could go to any other system for this, basically, if I really wanted to. But it's still neat. The other title you hear about, not part of the Holy Trinity because it is in a genre that some people are a little scared to approach, is Welcome to Pia Carrot. This is the second full fan translation on the system. It is a dating sim, essentially. So you work at this cafe, and there's a variety of ladies and girls there, and you essentially have the goal of romancing one of them by the end of the game. Unlike, like a romance visual novel or something like that, where you're essentially just selecting dialogue options, this game also has like a stat-based system. So in a little bit here, you'll see we'll be in like our room and we'll get to choose to study, or we can call somebody with their cell phone. There's like a time management aspect. You can see there's like money and the time of day and all that stuff in the corner. And this is one of those things where, some people don't want to play this because it is something that's a bit dense and different from what they're usually used to. But it is something that you can sit down and play through because it is entirely in English. I will say this is an 18+ game, so all of you be adults to play that game if you want to. But I will say, in saying that, I at least hope today we're at the point where there's an understanding that these 18+ games, while they do have erotic elements, are very good story-based games. Like I mentioned, characters are really a big focus of them, and what happens at the very end of the game does not sully the entire game itself. So you might want to be like, well, what about the other 51 video games on the PC-FX? Well, it's a lot harder to get into. Some of them are pretty straightforward. There's like a baseball game. There's like a strip poker game if you want, and like Shanghai. But those are kind of really straightforward games that are not particularly interesting in my opinion either, because they're basically just card games and things like that. So, if you're desperate, you can do that. There are some like neat visual elements to them, I will say. But when you get into the like simulation games, RPGs, the visual novels, things like that, there's a lot of things you have to be able to do. One, you got to be able to be patient. The understanding that you are maybe not going to have fun immediately, or maybe through the majority of the game, but it will be an interesting experience as you go through it. You just need to be willing to sit down and realize you might going to get stuck, essentially. And, you need to be able to, not just bounce, essentially, immediately. The next thing you need to be able to do is be observant. Pay a lot of attention to what's happening on screen. If you're playing an RPG, know what menu option's the cure button, right? That's probably pretty good and important to know. So if you pay attention to what your spells are doing, things like that, that will help you out quite a bit. There's also the other aspect of, being very observant of the environment, interact with as many things as you can, go and just press a button on a lot of things and see if something happens, basically. And then maybe more specific to, not knowing these games from a language perspective, is paying a lot of attention to the voice acting. Like I said, this is a system that is incredibly, dense with voice acting, and you can pick up a surprising amount by paying attention to how the characters are emoting on screen, and then what their voice tone is, and things like that. So if you want to get the general vibe of a game or general vibe of a character, if you sit there and actually listen to the character and see what they're doing, that's a big help in appreciating it. I played through all of First Kiss Story. I 100%ed it, all in Japanese. I do not know barely any Japanese, but I had a good time because I sat there and just listened to what everybody was saying. Another thing too is that, there's loaner words in languages. So in a game like Team Innocent, I showed you earlier with the survival horror aspect where you're walking around and those little codec calls come up and things like that. There can be literally things where a character will be like, oh, they'll say main computer, but in the Japanese way of saying main computer kind of thing. And so that's probably a pretty good hint. You need to go to the main computer room to, so keep an eye out for those kind of things. Another big helpful thing is research. Depending on the game, there's a variety of resources. Some of them have complete English guides. Other ones have partial guides. So this game here that I had showed you earlier, Ojo-sama Susomu, it's like a maze game where you're running away from these detectives essentially. And items are a pretty big part of the game. And knowing what those items do is pretty important. So there's an English translation of all those items online that you can find if you'd like. And also just seeing a playthrough of a game as well. Just looking at see what somebody's doing to get through a game is helpful as well. And the last bit is you need to be able to commit. You know, all these things are hard to do. You know, these are not easy things to just like sit down and be like, cool, I'm just going to enjoy a PC-FX game. You know, I think it's fine to like kind of taste test the system in terms of like trying different games on the system. But if you really want to experience an entire game, you really got to be like, no matter what happens, I'm going to finish this. Like, and I will use everything at my disposal I possibly can. So yeah. It's a rough life, the PC-FX life, if you don't speak Japanese. But if you want to join me, hey, you can do so in 2 ways. 1, you can play on an actual console. Got myself a PC-FX right here. Unfortunately, they are not super cheap these days anymore. You can definitely get one, but you know, maybe wait a little bit and see if the like market explodes or something at some point. But so you know, I don't know if I'd really recommend playing on actual console at this point. But you can play on emulator. The most popular way is using RetroArch, which uses I think Mednafen as like its plugin for PC-FX. I've heard very good things about running it that way. I have not done it myself, but it sounds like it's pretty dang accurate and will get you mostly what you need in that regard. There is one other aspect I want to talk about here real quick, and that is actually getting video games. So if you want to purchase video games for the PC-FX, anything that is just like, I'm going to punch things is going to be very expensive. So the Holy Trinity, that stuff is all very, very highly priced at this point. So I would not recommend getting in that space at all. Some of the cheaper, less desirable stuff, I'm not sure what this is anymore, but you know, you can find stuff for, you know, anywhere between like 10 to 40 bucks, depending on how willing people are to kind of approach it. I'm going to start a sub panel here that is completely unrelated to my PC-FX talk. It is talking about a website called archive.org. It's an amazing website where people upload a lot of really cool stuff on there. Sometimes they upload abandoned software for consoles people don't care about, and you can find cool stuff like that on there. Completely unrelated to my PC-FX talk right now. Don't worry about it. Very cool. And that's the end of both my presentations on archive.org and the PC-FX. Once again, I've been Benjamin Yoder with One Controller Port. If you probably don't know about me because I'm a very tiny YouTube channel, but I do a lot of like PC-FX related videos. I try to help people who only speak English play through games on the system, individual titles. I also do a lot of other stuff because I'm not a channel dedicated to the PC-FX. If you're familiar with the Nier franchise, I've compared like the brother and father Nier, how their dialogue is different between those games and what kind of effect that has on the story. I also talk about a lot of import games, things like that in general, for like the PlayStation, the Wii, things like that. So there's my little plug. Does anyone have any questions that I can answer at this point? Or no, it was a good long conversation there, but or are you all pretty good? All good? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming. Like I said, I have cards up here if you want them. Elizabeth's holding them. They may fall out of her hands. Don't worry about it. It's cool. I will not be offended if you destroy all my cards. So take it if you want. Otherwise, I really appreciate you guys coming today. And if you have any other questions, feel free to come up. If you want to look at the PC-FX, it's right here. If you want to look at a PC-FX game or PC98 game for some reason, that's there too. Here's my cool rock that's coming in. Please enjoy. This is my song. That's it.